What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that is at the forefront of raising standards. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Duchess of Sussex. That is, if we'll ever see her again. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make the world work. We discuss everything from why the high street has seen shockingly weak retail sales to the future of the economy for New South Wales. And of course, the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course, current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we are joined by Dan Reid, Managing Director of Engineered Learning. Engineered Learning bridges the gap between education and industry, inspiring and supporting young people below the age of 16 to develop engineering skills in partnership with schools across Derbyshire. Dan began his career in engineering as a teenager, winning the Young Engineer of Derby competition in 1982, aged just 13, and began working with British Rail in 1986. Since 1999, Dan was employed as the Principal Outdoor Education Training Instructor by Derby City Council, and in 2013 founded Engineered Learning. We discuss this and the sector more broadly now. Dan, welcome.
Hello there, how are you, Jonathan?
Very well, thank you. And first of all, I should just say thanks, Dan, for taking the time and joining us today. There's a lot to get through, in fact, but I thought it would be a very pleasant way to start. Dan, it's been a few months, obviously, since yourselves at Engineered Learning have been in the room. I think the listeners would love to know how you and the team are and what you've been up to.
Well, we've had lots of changes going on. Very, very busy. I fell out with one of my customers. In fact, I've refused access to them to our workshops because they were effectively fiddling with quality assurance to justify their own existence at our expense. And I wasn't going to sit back and allow that to happen. My team and my students work incredibly hard and deserve the recognition. So we've had that to deal with. I've lost a lot of work because I did stand up to the bullies, which I don't mind doing because I like to lead by example.
Absolutely.
I've spent a lot of time, especially over summer, generating new work, which has been successful, and I'm almost back to where I was before that happened, really. So, going quite well.
Excellent. Well, I think, and as I said, there is quite a lot to talk about, but just so listeners are aware, and in case they probably won't know, but yourself, Dan, you've spent your working life in engineering and education. And what was that initial inspiration, the impetus for founding Engineered Learning now, 7 years ago?
Oh, okay. Well, I was a similar kind of lad when I was younger, getting myself into all sorts of mischief. And I was very fortunate enough to have an apprenticeship with the Derby Loco Works, where I had some very big, burly men straighten me out. And as tough as it was at the time, it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Moving on from that, it was I went into youth work. I specialised in outdoor education. Such like need for me to get out of workshops and into the great outdoors. And I spent about 20 years teaching rock climbing, mountaineering, caving, etc. Rising to the head of department within the local youth service, so the head of outdoor ed for Derby City. Good times came to an end. I was looking at what was out there. I had a choice of either becoming a freelance outdoor instructor or going back on the tools and back into industry. Neither of which really appealed to me. Looking at what was happening with young people through my youth work, and realised that there was nobody delivering engineering to young people like I experienced through my school days. I was pouring molten aluminium at the age of 12 in the metalwork room, access to forges and furnaces, etc.
You can imagine that now.
Exactly. It's mad that it's not there, especially with all the skill shortages, and I suppose that sort of identifies the problem that we've got. So it was a case of, for me, putting the two skill sets that I've got together with the contacts that I've developed over the years of being a youth worker, and came up with engineered learning. And it started on with an 8-week trial at Kingsmead Pupil Referral Unit in Derby. They've got a long-standing relationship with throughout the head. And that ran for 5 months in their car park, repairing a shipping container that they needed for storage. And then you need a workshop. We want to carry on with you, so we offer you 1 day's work a week. So I rented a workshop space up at an old friend of mine. It was quiet, and I made up the rest of the working week either doing freelance welding work on machine buckets, and again freelance outdoor instructing. And then so the work built, and now I have 4 workshops, all totally self-funded. I have no financial support from anybody. And yeah, here I am. Every time I've learned a bit, I've brought a bit of kitchen. Yeah.
It has been a fantastic story since, and something you probably no doubt, and you should be very proud of, Dan. And I know you've touched on, and we'll talk about this, I think, in a bit more detail in a moment, that the skills gap that does exist, but that I think we shouldn't ignore that you do something else. Obviously, a lot of the young people you work with have been obviously excluded from mainstream education. It would be fair to say that you're not just teaching them a skill set for many, and making them employable, I should add, but giving them a sense of purpose in life that many might not be able to find in other aspects.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Jonathan. You bang on the bang on the head there. We deliver probably. I'd say that the engineering aspect is probably around about 25% of what we actually deliver. Almost off our youth workers as well as engineers. We do give them a sense of purpose and achievement. We manufacture as part of that training. We don't just do hanging baskets for grandma like the traditional school workshop would do. And I've had to do that to recover the cost of the materials and the consumables, because, as we know, there's not any money in education. I've had to find a way of making it work. So, our young people do invest, into industry, manufacture. We've got some, really good work going on with skips and environmentation work through Jackson Civils, who are great supporters of ours. And so it goes on. But we've recently taken on a contract with Derby City Council, and we're making 57 planters that go into all the shopping precincts across Derby City, where the young people have now invested into their own environment, and you've got that social return that comes back. So they're less likely to cause damage in that environment because they've created it. And that's something we're looking to develop further. The City Council love the work that we're doing. Because education is paying for it, we're a lot cheaper than anybody else because there's no labour costs involved. It's just about recovering the cost of the materials and the consumables. And we're working with gang cultures now, so that's a very big problem in Derby City at the moment. We're working alongside, we're not working alongside anyone, we're doing it all ourselves, is the honesty of it. But we would do a lot of informal youth work alongside our engineering training. And that gives a lot of value to what we do.
And I did want to bring that up, Dan, because I think perhaps even for those that might be familiar with the sector, I think a lot of people just aren't familiar with how much other work there is to do, especially on the more human side of things. And that's something you do every day.
Yeah.
Now, you've brought it up already, Dan. You've got a strong ethos at Engineered Learning that, as you said in the review, that every educational opportunity is a manufacturing opportunity. Now, It's no secret in this country that we have a bit of a skills gap. I think the government study of 2018 had suggested that if we trained 186,000 extra recruits each year until 2024, we'd just about plug that gap. Now, you and I both know that is, at this point, a little unrealistic. What, though, and how important is it for educational services like yourself and business to work together on that front to actually accomplish something good for the economy in the country?
It's massively important, and to be fair to industry, they are giving me that support. They recognise the skills gap. They recognise that nobody is developing those skills within young people. no one's raising the aspirations of young people in pre-16 education or young people aren't aware that these career paths exist. And that, for me, is the big shock. I've been asked to support D2M2 in terms of supporting schools and the way they offer careers training and opportunities to their young people. But it has to be voluntary. There's just not enough money in there. I scrape a living off 4 workshops, and I should be a lot more affluent than I am for the work that I put in, and so should my staff.
Absolutely.
And that is part of the problem. I think for me, there's far too many subcontractors involved from where the main funding comes from, so that by the time it gets down to my level, there's not enough to pay for it. In terms of industry and schools working together, schools or Ofsted or the government Department of Education got to put it back on the curriculum so that schools actually start to deliver it. And until that happens, nothing's going to change. Like I spoke earlier, I was pouring aluminium at the age of 12 because that's what the school curriculum said that's what schools should do. So I wasn't any different to every other 12-year-old up and down the country who was all making screwdrivers because at the time the country needed the skills. The country needs the skills again, but education isn't catching up with what the country needs. And it comes from central government. It's got to be directed by central government to give schools the opportunity to develop these skills for industry.
Absolutely, they call it a comprehensive education, but it's not quite. And some of us will be old enough to remember when you could, at a young age, get a very decent technical education in this country.
Yes.
And we only have to look to the continent. Germany do it so well, where at the age of 14 they have the opportunity, anybody has the opportunity to focus on that. Now, we don't have to do the same way, but I think you're spot on, Dan. It's about time perhaps we look at what others are doing, often more successfully than us, or listening to the people already doing it in this country and following their lead. But taking a step back, though, Dan, and looking more broadly at the sector, both engineering and education, what would you say, Dan, and maybe we've already talked about it, maybe it is that exact lack of education there, but what would you identify as perhaps the major challenge facing the sector in the medium term? Is it the lack of numbers?
It is lack of numbers. I mean, and that lack of numbers is always going to be there until we start to train again from an early age. I'm working with employers who are struggling to recruit, because the vast majority of people who are employable have a set expectation of salary that can't be met because of their lack of experience, because they've never been into industry. The industry as itself is not really trained for 30 years. So there's that massive generational gap. So some of the employers I speak to, they'll put adverts out, for example, for a number of staff, and they'll have people applying who've been in call centres and want to change. But they want a salary that's similar to what they've achieved for their age and experience in call centres. But because they have no experience of the industry, they are not worth that money. And it's that kind of crossover going on. So there's a massive need to upskill mature people who have missed out on in that 30-year skills training gap, as much as it is about preparing young people to go into those industries and support what we're doing. I think there's far too much emphasis on technology than there is the hand skills, and what people seem to be missing is that someone needs to build the buildings that you're going to do your technology
Absolutely.
in. And your transport supply systems, etc. The whole logistical system behind that and other industries as well needs to be supported by our type of young people and our type of industry.
I think there's a general feeling, Dan, especially in Westminster, that now there's a government with an actual majority that can put aside Brexit. They're actually able to talk about things like education, healthcare, and especially job training and retraining.
Yes.
And obviously, quite rightly, everyone should say, well, we'll believe it when we see it. But I think there is a hope that the government and the Chancellor especially is very keen about talking about levelling up. And a big part of that must be surely taking people, not just young people, obviously, but adults that you've identified already, Dan, as having missed out on that education, as retraining? Yes. Because not only is there a demand for it, but I mean, I think you've spoken about this before previously, Dan, but whether it's inspiring competition as teenagers within schools competitions, or indeed serving links with those that have either been down on their luck, homeless, or perhaps even with the prison services. There are opportunities that government could really take advantage of.
Without a shadow of doubt, and they're all avenues that I'm trying to take my business down, working with youth offending, young offenders, retraining. You've got, former service people coming out, veterans coming out who need retraining, etc., would appreciate to be retrained, and all those avenues. I think the big issue for me is that the government talks to what I would term government experts, and what they should be doing is talking to the people on the coalface like ourselves, and there's other providers like us, who will tell you exactly how it really is. And I kind of touched on it earlier. I think that there's that many subcontractors in between the funding and to people at my level getting hands on that money. There's nothing left for us. And it's also very, very difficult for us to access funding. I've employed somebody 2 days a week to chase funding because I'm trying to go in these other directions, and I'm finding very little support. And you're going around in circles. There's that many institutions or organisations within one organisation. You keep chasing the money, you keep going back down the same blind alley. It takes you back to the same one. And it's almost like the money's there just to spin the economy rather than actually solve the problem. I went to a skills summit just before Christmas. It was a full-day summit, and come dinner time, I went back to work because I was just being told the same stuff that I'd heard for 30 years. And nothing's actually being done. Lots of people are taking the money, saying they're doing things, and producing nothing. And that's one of the biggest problems. Instead of handing out all money to a big overarching organisation, subcontract, just give it straight to the people on the coalface. Give it straight to the people who are going to use it effectively and give absolute value for money. Others aren't doing.
And the future will be interesting on that front, Dan, because either we do this and we become competitive and we train a new generation of engineers, or we become less competitive as an economy, which now we need to be as competitive as we ever have been before, and we consign another generation of could-be engineers into unproductive and often careers with no future in them.
Yeah, if you look back at what's happened, Jonathan, there was a big push to get young people into level 3s and upskill, raise the standards. And I totally get that, and I agree with that. And I think that idea was brilliant. But it was very poorly executed. And if you look at the wider society, what we've done over a period of years, generations, as our society's developed, which is great. And I accept and acknowledge that this country is at the forefront of social change. I think that's something I'm really proud of. We took away consequence, we took away discipline, and we've taken away necessity. And we're expecting young people to step up to the level 3s, 4s, 5s without any necessity, without any need to. And, naturally, it's like, that's not going to happen, pal. And we now have a generation of young people, especially ones that I've been training, who are, highly skilled welders considering their age.
Yes.
The type of training that we do, rather than the traditional college-based workshop, repetitive type training, we manufacture as part of ours. So there's a greater depth of experience to our young people, our former students who go on. But they can't access further education or apprenticeships because they haven't got a GCSE in English and maths. So therefore we end up neat, which is absolute madness. And I constantly get students come back to me saying, Dan, I can't go any further because I didn't do the English and maths. And there's one or two students. Sorry?
The wasted talent there is unacceptable.
It's disgraceful, is what it is, because these young people, and to be fair, as I've gone through my own life, and my English and maths has probably stayed at the same level or gone backwards since I was at school, because I only use what I need. And we teach far beyond in mainstream school what we need to get through our everyday lives. I understand the functional skills, and that was a good push from the government to raise standards, etc. but there's got to be something behind it that encourages those people to take part. And all they've done is actually discourage people from taking part.
It's spot on, Dan. I think the future's got to be one with an education system that is much more tailored to the individual. And if it doesn't do that, I mean, the consequences won't be good ones. Now, I knew we could talk about this all afternoon. I'm conscious of the time, though. I should, and you've already touched on it, Dan, but I've got to ask, perhaps in conclusion, what are the plans for the next 12 months or so for yourselves at Engineered Learning?
For Engineered Learning, I just want to keep bringing work in. I want more workshops. I'm chasing the money to make that happen. And basically, what I'm asking for is support. I've done this all on my own. I've taken myself from a pickup truck in a school car park to 4 workshops. I've got 3 workshops doing fab and weld. I've got another one doing motor vehicle. But again, make it exciting, make it real world, and build kit cars. I've just recently started one in the same workshop building computers. But again, we'll have to offer coding, so we'll make it more exciting. We'll start with a bare case, we'll build the computer, and then we'll code it. And one of the plans I want for this year is to bring in CNC machines, plasma cutting machines, or even lasers if I've got the financial support to make that happen, so that I can cut for industry as well as manufacture for industry. But the young people who are doing the coding and building the computers will actually program the plasma from a remote building, from the other side of Derby, and then see what they've cut, etc. So that's where I want to be in 12 months' time. I want CNC plasma cutters, and I want a plasma cutter. I'd like a CNC press brake so we can continue manufacturing and offering our young people to industry, work-ready young people who want to work, fit for purpose, instant asset to employees.
Fantastic. Well, I hope, and very much hope indeed, that we'll be able to talk about that when it happens at some point this year. But for now, Dan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for your time, Jonathan. I really appreciate your interest.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Dan, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Engineered Learning are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now.
Lord Pickles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. But of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you president there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because, you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want. And I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership.
Well, I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you all know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, And it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, you're echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said. What some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner-city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I will join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around. And my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed. But do you know, I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story, most people might guess that a dying Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Blunkett was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realise that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road, Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state. And it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress, since of course you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like they got in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to evensong and Warburn. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working on with that, and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you referenced as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, you know, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. And the hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine actually that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to.
we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know this is going to be a huge focus of the next review. Because thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Buckingham Arms to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.